Our next speaker is a product expert who had a very traumatic personal experience and has brought those two together with the design thinking mind and the personal experience that is obviously something incredibly subjective. And by bringing those two things, he's bringing new hope to an otherwise scary and traumatic experience. So I'd like you to welcome Janae.
Janae, and I'm the founder of the Sharp Index, and I also have 3 children. Talking today about my experience and about physician suicide. And, oh, look at that. See that? That's a graphic. And I'm actually not a UX designer, as you'll be able to tell when you see my slideshow. I've said like 5 times already. So people who are tracking, you can put the hash marks there. When I talk to people about physician suicide, I like to talk about some of the data that's out there. And not all the data about physician suicide is great. And there isn't a ton of data available. Some of that is due to people wanting to hide it. It's not always a reported cause of death. It does have a social impact, it has a financial impact. And in healthcare, it also has an impact on the employer. So there is some stigma there. And there's a lot of discussion about the relationship between burnout and suicide. And more than half of the physicians in the US are experiencing some form of burnout. Does anyone, raise your hand if you've been to a physician and had a bad experience or felt like they weren't that great? Okay, yeah. That's usually most people. And the United States healthcare, we cost a lot for patients and we don't give great care. Each year we lose around 400 physicians to suicide. Guys, I didn't know these animations were there because my friend helped, but I feel like they're pretty nice. It means I'm going to have to click like 500,000 times, but see, that's a diamond. Just kind of weird when you're talking about suicide, but sorry. Each year, those 400 physicians, that means that about 1 million patients are losing their physician to suicide each year. And that doesn't count the patients that have a doctor that is actively suicidal, which would put the cost even higher. So physicians, when they are at risk for suicide, obviously, when you're depressed, when you're burned out and you hate your job, you don't give great care. You don't do a great job at a job that you hate. So the cost of medical error due to mental health issues is really high, but we don't know the true cost. So if anyone's really good at cost analysis studies, first of all, there's not very good data, but you should get involved. For me personally, it's something that I care about because my husband was a physician who died by suicide before starting his residency in pathology. So when I talk to people about it, I don't have to lie. I don't have to say everything's okay because he passed away. And working in healthcare, that's been a great opportunity to be able to talk about it. But I also understand what it's like to not really understand the mental health of someone else and not really know what to say. And I've experienced a death that's really traumatic and seen how people responded to that. John, he was a creator. Like, he wrote music. He wanted to write. He always was interested in things, and he wanted to be perfect. He wanted to be a perfect father. He wanted to be a perfect physician. He wanted to bring people sight. And that loss has been surprisingly hard for me and for my children. And it's a little bit strange still. It's been 3 years. May 21st was the anniversary of him passing away. And suicide death also usually has less support from the community. Has anyone here, if you raise your hand, how many people have had a physician or known a physician or someone in training that's died by suicide? How about anyone who knows a friend or anyone in your circle? And how many people knew what to say? People ask me all the time, like, what should you say? What do you do? And there are no good answers. So with a death like that, with social stigma and the trauma, people usually don't know what to say. There's no right way to grieve. 3 weeks after he died, someone's like, yeah, but like, when are you getting remarried? I was like never, probably. I don't want to be rude, but like, they don't understand, so they don't talk about it, and there's this silence afterwards. When I talk to some physicians, I have the opportunity to hear their stories and to hear about their training. And one of them told me the story after her daughter was ill. She's a physician. She's high achievement. Every day for 5 years, she would go to work and line up 1,000 units of insulin and think about if she was going to take her own life. So we have stories of these people who are thinking every day and going through that ritual as they're training for surgery or as they're in school of how would I die and what would that look like? Physicians are actually 70% higher than other professions to die by suicide, and female physicians are a very high risk. They have a higher amount of completed suicide attempts, and a lot of people point to access, knowledge. They know a lot about life and the stress of their work. And anesthesiologists and psychiatrists have a higher rate. There's also, generally, our society isn't connecting. We are having more deaths by suicide. It's the 10th leading cause of death in the US. In Utah, where I live now, it's the leading cause of death for young men above accidental death from 18 to 25. And I taught German, like in a former life. And at the high school that some of my students went to, last year, 5 students died by suicide at one high school. And it's not something that we have a good solution for. And middle-aged men are also at risk. One of the interesting things about medicine is that they know there's a problem. And they have physician wellness programs, like we all have. We have this culture that's telling us, oh, you're burned out. You know what you need to do? You need to take some time for you. You need to take some self-care and do some yoga. So I always say, sometimes when I'm speaking at these conferences, it's like, or looking at someone's wellness program, it's like the Stepford Wives. They're like, look, here's our wellness program. We're all okay here. We're gonna do great. You're all burned out and you hate your job. That's okay. Why don't you just recenter and get a purpose in life so you can give your deliverables on time? And since I love sarcasm as a coping tool, I always think of like, we're really kind of dismissive of what their real lives are like. And it's like Stuart Smalley on Saturday Night Live, like, you're good enough, you're smart enough, and people like you. I do yoga though, and it's helpful. But if my employer's like, hey, you seem a little testy today, maybe you could just go recenter. I'd be like, oh, thank you. That's a really nice thing to say. So personally, I hated that term, burnout. I was like, this is the most stupid thing. People are dying. And you guys are like, it's burnout. And John died by fire, which was super traumatic. So every time people talk about burnout, a little bit of me is like, is that really what you want to say? Like, you really want to say that? And they would say, it's stress. Mood and substance issues, those are risk factors. If you have a mental illness that's not treated, it's always complex. And that's part of our problem with suicide. We want an answer. You died of cancer. You died of a car accident. With suicide, people say, why did this happen? And there are always multiple factors. Did they have a bad family life? Did they have a bad work life? And part of the problem is that we don't have a great cognitive ability to look at multiple factors leading up to one event. We also don't have a great, see that? That was a zoom in. We don't have a great ability to deal with that. Physicians, oh, that didn't turn out how I wanted it to, have the same rates of depression as other populations. They have a slightly higher instance of substance abuse, and that starts in training. When my husband started school, I was like a stay-at-home mom, super sheltered religious background, and I was shocked. I was like, everybody's a drunk here. Everybody's an alcoholic. Is that normal? Even though they probably weren't actually quantifiably alcoholics, but to me they were. And they're all like, hey, here's some Adderall for your test. And I'm like, is that a thing? I didn't know that was a thing, to like share drugs. And that was normal. So culturally, that's not really something that healthcare systems talk about, but they do have a higher than average substance abuse rate. And if they have an existing mental health disorder, they're higher risk. The interesting thing about that is when you're getting your license for practicing medicine, many states ask you for your entire mental health history, which people have said is discriminatory. If I have a mental health issue, I shouldn't not be able to work. So there's a strong incentive for physicians not to tell you if they have a problem. And this year, I call the year of the EHR blame. Like, blame the tech. Like, if you're feeling bad, you might just have a bad computer. Electronic health records. Does anyone know a lot about electronic health records? They're terrible, unless you love them. What?
I've watched the work hours go from a normal day to 12 to 14 hours a day just to deal with the notes because the user interface is so bad.
Right. The user interface, which we need people to help with, is terrible. It was a billing tool that was pushed through Congress, through legislation by very savvy individuals. It also means that 52% of your time as a physician is spent in your electronic health record. And 30% of your time as a physician is actually doing what you thought was practicing medicine. So there's a feeling of disenfranchisement, of not being empowered. And most of them go home and practice it. But the problem for me with this narrative that's really that, if we fix the EHR, if we fix the computer, it'll be okay. But the rates of suicide are increasing in training, not just when you're using your EHR. And the rates don't correlate with whether or not you're someone who is heavily involved in that. So I talked to the people at Class Research, and they did a survey of 15,000 physicians, and the EHR is a source of misery, but it's not always associated with burnout. And see that? I really like the graph. So your experience score at your work, if you have terrible tech, isn't necessarily going to lead to that. And I don't know. What we did with the Sharp Index, we've done several things, but one of the things I did was talk to some of my friends that ran healthcare systems and said, look, we have this EHR data. What can we see from it? And we pulled all the encounters with the different users, and we filtered them out for physicians. And we had to do some cleaning. We realized during the experience that one of the systems had like a universal login that was doing 30% of their coding, and that's super illegal, but they're working through it. Nobody got fined. But if you look at the heat graph and the hours of the day, we had roughly 4 hours. This is across multiple users and multiple health systems, by the way. Roughly 4 hours where you're not doing a lot of intensive recording. And the names are fake, by the way, if you ever download the slides. So I'm not a physician, but I have had kids, and I know what it's like to never sleep ever again. So pretty much, if I'm an emergency medicine physician, I can just be like, hey, how about you just sleep for 4 hours for the rest of your life? You're going to have some side effects from that. For me, with my second kid who never slept, I felt like I was hallucinating. Like at 6 months, I like called my sister-in-law. I was like, I think I actually am hallucinating now, for real. She's like, you probably are, you sound nuts. So she came. And what we're doing is taking a workforce that is consistently not sleeping and expecting them to perform high-pressure tasks and also do their yoga class. So with the Sharp Index, part of what we do, since I really like data scientists and data tools, like we're able to take that and help healthcare systems clean their data. But really, the goal is to decrease burnout, which means we have multiple things we need to do. And the number one factor in whether or not you will recover from burnout or you will recover from an intense depression is actually your social support, your structure. Like if you have a great community, if you have family that believes in you and helps you. So we're trying to help create that and offer it anonymously. So that if I'm at my work, I don't know if you know this, but if I'm at my job and they're like, hey, how are you doing in life? I'm gonna be like, so good. I'm doing so good. You wouldn't even believe it, even if I'm gonna quit the next day. Because I don't wanna talk about it with my work. I don't wanna get fired because I hate my job. I will find a new job and then quit. Nobody wants to talk to their boss about their horrible, depressive thoughts and then later have it come back to them, because it will. So we're trying to offer it anonymously. Guys, here's some data from our responses. I don't know if you're excited about this, but I am. So if we look at this, we asked people at the end if they wanted to be texted, if they want us to reach out to them. Because we have an online tool. It measures your burnout score, the Maslow burnout inventory, and it also measures your, we call it a stress score. It's a PHQ-4, if you're familiar with that. And of those people, 12% asked to be tested. And we had a few people, I don't know if you can see over there, see the dots over to the right? So some of the dots are outliers, and they don't really fit. And when I was working with the Click healthcare team, they're like, who are these people? And I happened to know who all the dots were that were outliers because they had helped us. And they were people who were in very supportive environments. So I hate my job, but I happen to know and go to counseling every week and have great coping tools. So you can identify those people from our information. And 107 of our responses of the data here, which we only have 252, they're flagged for concern, which means you have high burnout and you have a high stress score. Interestingly, the people with the worst scores didn't ask to be contacted. So you want to find people who actually have that spot where they're able to deal with it. I know for me, after John died, I was devastated. And I didn't really want to talk to anyone. People are like, oh, you should go to counseling like 20 hours a week, roughly. And there's a period where you're not really able to, well, for me, probably other people are better at it, where you aren't able to make an active effort. And that's why it's so important for us to be able to identify those people and help them. So also, since we're new, my site was not optimized, so people could only really find it through like direct links at first. And we've had coverage from ZDogg, MD, like just different media places, podcasts. And most of the people we're reaching are female. And many of the people don't state their gender. So they might want access to tools without gender or without anything that would identify them possibly. Interestingly, even though we're mostly getting responses from females, males are more likely to say they would like a text follow-up and include their phone number. And whether or not you opt in has nothing to do with your actual burnout score. We also have these tools, and this has been an interesting part for me, where you can have anonymous tools, learning, coping tools. The most effective physicians are the physicians that can be very engaged and very empathetic. We also know that some of those physicians have bad coping tools. They're the most susceptible to burnout. When you care deeply about something, you talk about it and you're very engaging and you're very good at what you do. But you're also going to get disillusioned. When I look at it, it's very obvious. If I was a trauma surgeon and I'm caring for gunshot wounds and all these sick people, after a while, your brain chemistry changes. You don't have the same cortisol response to stress anymore. And things that would normally trigger a stress response, nothing will happen for you. And when you have a really engaged idealist working, they'll have that same experience where they're hyper engaged in the situation and it's just too much. So we have to give them the tools to separate. And not all those tools are clearly defined. There's no easy answer, obviously. Otherwise, our rates of suicide wouldn't be increasing. And we've worked with some different tools with Stella Care. They're founded by a licensed clinical social worker, works with patients. She started working with patients that were diabetic, but they wouldn't go to their treatment because of mental health issues. But they weren't actually ready to say, I have a mental health issue. Because not everybody wants to hear that. And physicians also don't want to hear that, just like literally everyone else. So we work with people who don't want to hear that, but need the tools to allow them to maintain their identity and maintain super engaged care. And I really like data, so I hope you guys all really liked the data, because there's some other really cool data, not in this slide, but it's been interesting to me to be able to take my background where I work with healthcare systems, I know how to say, hey, let's look at all your EHR data. If you see large changes, you might have an employee who is at risk. You probably have an employee who will quit. And what can we do, given that you are only giving your employees 4 hours off a day and giving them 1 hour of work for their physician wellness program in those 4 hours? And I felt really lucky because I'm allowed to say those things. As a loss survivor, I can tell people it's terrible. And it's still terrible. And for them, they've probably had colleagues that have passed away, but they don't know how to solve it. So it's been this experience of like learning and trying to get more people tools has made me realize how important it is to share those stories that we have. That I'm not like Mother Teresa. I'm not like the inspirational lady who 5 days later was okay and like just knew like everything's gonna be good. Now I'm like a motivational speaker who coaches you. Like, this is not really me. I'm more like, you know what really helps with burnout is also swearing. It's really legitimate, which is also data-backed. But for me, it was also about creating a better legacy for John, where he didn't have the tools or the support that he needed, and for my kids, where people would be able to talk to them about their father without guilt. So I'd love to hear if you have questions. You can find me. But